and welcome to the Hybrid School Builders Podcast. I am your host, Rebecca Foley, and I am so glad you are joining me today. I am a fellow grassroots founder who is hoping to make your journey toward founding a sustainable hybrid school a little bit easier. If you are dreaming of starting a hybrid school, or perhaps you've already gotten started, you are in the right place. Join me as we dive into real stories, practical tips, and hard-won lessons that I have learned to help you launch and grow your program with confidence. Remember, building a hybrid school is not just about creating a business or creating jobs. It's not even about just serving the children who attend the program. It's literally about reshaping the landscape of education, and we can do that one community, one entrepreneur, and one program at a time. Hi again. Today I wanted to continue our conversation on your business structure. So we talked in the last episode about the private school versus the business. And that's a really important distinction because those are two very different models legally. Now, when it comes down to what it actually looks like day to day, they can actually look very similar, besides the major difference that what is done at home has to be held accountable to the school if you are legally a school, where if you're a homeschool supplement, that isn't necessary. But I highly suggest a strong, robust home recommendation anyway, even if you're not a legal school. So when it comes down to it, it can look very similar. Okay, so we talked about that in the last episode. Now we're going to talk about a business structure. Okay, so if you're taking the school route, you have to follow your legal recommendations in your state to become a school. Okay. And then there will be upcoming episodes that will still be very applicable to you as far as curriculum and schedules and hiring people and insurances and all of that stuff. But this episode is for those of you who are starting a business. You're just going to start a business that serves people who are legally homeschooling. So your choices are most likely going to be starting a LLC, a limited liability company, or a nonprofit, a 501c3. Okay, there are some other things out there, but those are the two main businesses that you can start, business like legal business models. Okay, so I want to make sure that you understand the difference between those two, because when you file your paperwork to become an entity with your state, which is one of the first things that you'll do, you want to choose the right one, knowing what you're like getting into, okay, and what benefits and limitations there are to each of those. Okay. So let's talk about the LLC first, because that is actually simpler. LLC stands for Limited Liability Company. Let me not forget to give my disclaimer that I am not a lawyer or a accountant. So what I'm telling you is what I have experienced and researched, but I am not official on this. So if you want to meet with a lawyer to talk about setting up an LLC or an accountant to talk about how your taxes will work, please do that. That said, LLC is limited liability, okay? And what that means is you are separate. You as a person are separated from your business. You create a business entity that is not you. A sole proprietor is when you don't create a business entity and any services that you offer, like let's say you were just like babysitting or offering tutoring out of your home to a few students and people just paid you, wrote you a check or cash or whatever. That would it just went into your personal bank account. That would be sole proprietor, okay? You're still supposed to claim that on your taxes, your personal taxes, but that's sole proprietor. It's you. If anybody decided to sue you or, say that you didn't have insurance and something happened to their kid or whatever, they could go after you as a person, like your own personal stuff. That's why limited liability means that you have limited liability as a person, and the business becomes its own separate entity that isn't you, okay? So I highly suggest for sure creating an LLC and not a sole proprietor when you're offering services to people like this, especially more than like one or two people. Okay, so an LLC, however, is you file the paperwork with the state. You can use a service. I have done it by myself. It's not really that complex. It's a couple of pages, maybe 1 or 2 pages. You have to name it. You have to give it a business address, which can just be your home, or you can use like a registered agent, which is just a service you pay to get like your official mail. you choose what business entity you're going to be, you pay a fee, and you send it in, and now you're a business, okay? When you do that, you can then get an EIN, an employer identification number, and that's through the IRS, okay, the Internal Revenue Service that we all have to deal with, okay? Now, this is all legal government stuff so that you're an actual entity, okay? So you file that paperwork as an LLC, and then you get your EIN, and then I highly recommend opening a separate bank account that's your business bank account and doing all your transactions from that, okay? So that helps separate you from the business, all right? Now, why would you open an LLC besides not being a sole proprietor and having limited liability? Well, an LLC is literally just starting a business, and you are the business owner. It's just you. You can profit from the business. You can draw from the profits of the business, and it then gets reported on your personal taxes. When you file your personal taxes, there's an extra form you have to fill out. Your accountant fills out. It says, I brought in this much from my business, and you have to pay your personal tax rate on that, okay? But the big benefit is that you can write off business expenses, right? You can write off anything that was used for your business, which please track in your business account. You can write off, the purchase of equipment. You can write off salaries for employees. You can write off insurance costs. You write off all of these business expenses. And and then you have your revenue. So you bring in the money from your students, and then you reduce the costs. Whatever is left is yours to do as you please with. You could pay yourself out of that. You can draw from that. It's your money, but you will have to report it on your taxes to get taxed on it later, okay? Including employment, employer taxes and all of that on yourself. There is another way, and please talk to an accountant about this, where you can file as, I believe it's an S corporation, where you actually make yourself an employee of your LLC and draw a salary where the business pays employer taxes on you on just like a set salary, and then the business has to pay corporate taxes separately on whatever is left. There is no board, there's no bylaws, there's nobody else you have to be accountable to. You can govern the entire business, you can make all your own decisions, you're not answerable to anybody else, okay? This is the biggest benefit of an LLC. In my opinion, it's a benefit. You might not see it as a benefit. It's a benefit because if you take the risks, you put in the hard work, the sweat equity, you put in maybe your own dollars to get things going, you succeed, you get to pull from the reward of that. If you don't succeed, you also have to bear the risk of that. You might lose your money, right? That's also possible. But that's like the entrepreneurial, capitalistic, free market. That's how it works, right? Okay, so that point is the biggest reason that you need to understand that model versus a nonprofit, okay? Now, a nonprofit is called that because you cannot profit. You cannot pull from the profits of the business. So if you have $60,000 left after writing off all the expenses and you're a nonprofit, that is not your money, and it is not it remains with the business, but the business doesn't have to pay taxes on it. Okay, that's a big benefit. So if you want to get paid in a nonprofit, you have to be an employee, but you don't get to govern. You don't get to make the actual legal and compliance and strategic decisions. You're not supposed to be doing that. A board is supposed to be doing that. And the board can do whatever they would like with the executive director position. They're really only supposed to be monitoring the executive director position, not the rest of the employees. And they set your salary, and then you just become an employee of the business, but you're not allowed to vote or govern. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about that. So if you start a nonprofit, and I'm speaking to you as a founder, you are probably going to send in the paperwork to the state, and then it's your responsibility to make sure there's a board and there's bylaws, and that the board is making the governing decisions, and they're responsible for the compliance, the financial, transparency, the strategic planning, in the sense that they're making sure that the business is sustainable and responsible and is going to exist beyond any one person. That's what the board is supposed to be doing. Okay. Now, there's a whole other thing about whether or not boards engage the way that they should on that, because the boards cannot be employees. They can't benefit. They can't get paid. They can't get tuition benefit. All that stuff gets into a territory that you really shouldn't be in that could cause trouble. Okay. So the whole idea of a charity and nonprofit is that it's being governed by people who aren't benefiting. That's the big thing that you need to understand as a founder. Okay. So the benefits of creating a nonprofit and dealing with that, because it is more complex, coming up with board members, finding board members, having meetings, creating bylaws, having these volunteers do these very important things and actually do them and follow up on them. It's honestly easier to do it yourself most of the time. And a lot of founders end up doing it themselves, even though they're not really supposed to, just because they want it to make sure it gets done. So why would you bother with all that? Okay, well, it's because you don't have to pay taxes. The business doesn't have to pay taxes on any money that is left. People can donate and write that off their taxes. Okay, so if you're going to rely heavily on donations, or even a little bit, any amount of significance on donations or fundraisers, you need to be a nonprofit so that you can do fundraisers, you can apply for grants. A lot of grants are not open to for-profit businesses. They're only open to nonprofits. So there's a big financial benefit as far as that goes. Now, I will say that when we started the first few years, we did hardly any fundraising. We just did not have the time or the knowledge. We were trying to make everything run. And I had created our budget so that our tuition was covering our expenses. Like I didn't create a model that needed donations and fundraising to fund it. Okay. Depending on what your mission is, you may have to do that, in which case you're going to have to be a nonprofit. Okay. But I did not do that. So really there wasn't a huge benefit in the beginning. But after several years, when we had enough staff to help with writing for grants and, a parent volunteer who just jumped right in and did a bunch of fundraising stuff, started raising, it went from a few $100s for like a jogathon or something the first year, and like a tricky tray thing that a parent had helped put together that raised a few $100s. And this is when we were small. But then after we'd gotten to 60, 80, 100 kids, we had parents pitching in and doing a lot of work and had more money to pay staff. We were able to apply for grants, and we got like a several $1,000 grant for launching the high school program. And over the course of the last couple of years, it's been several grants, worth tens of thousands of dollars at this point that we would not have gotten if we had been for profit. Okay. And probably close to $10,000 in fundraising, small fundraising events, added up. That was money I could not even think about raising in our first few years. But in the long run, it did benefit. Okay. So you don't have to pay taxes, and people can donate and write it off their taxes. You can do fundraisers, and you can get grants. Now, even if you're like, well, I still don't want to hassle with that. I'm just going to be small and I'm just going to have tuition pay for everything, and that's fine. That's great, except for one big problem. And it doesn't have to be a problem, but it often is for a lot of people. And that is that if you plan on renting a facility from a church, it can cause problems for the church if you are a for-profit. Okay, so you have to talk to an accountant and you have to say, I want to be a for-profit business if you want to do that. But my best options for facilities are churches. Am I not going to have any churches want to even talk to me if I'm a for-profit business? Okay, it's quite likely, in my understanding, that churches are going to shy away from that because they have big tax write-off. They're churches, so they don't have to pay property taxes. But if they start charging to a for-profit and they collect money from a for-profit to use their facility, that does not look good. Okay. It's not, my understanding is they're not supposed to do that. Okay. So I think it can be worked out. So if you're really like, I want to start an LLC and I have this church that wants to, let me use their facility, you have to make sure you talk to the church leaders and their accounting people. Like, they have to understand your business structure, and you have to talk to an accountant and make sure everything is clear and on the up and up for that. Okay. So all that to say, one of the big reasons that people will choose a nonprofit is because they're pretty sure that they're going to have to rent from a church. Okay. Now, if you don't have to run from a church and you're going to run this out of your personal property, or you've budgeted and you're pretty sure you can afford a commercial space, and I will talk more about that in facilities. If you're only running a 2-day-week program, unless you are sharing, it's really hard to afford a commercial space at full commercial prices, even if it's just a little storefront or something with a 2-day-week program. Like the rent is built for a full-time use of the program, so you have to somehow figure out a cash flow for that. But depending on what your situation is, you may be able to do that. Or if you're running a 2-day program and a 3-day program, 2 different part-time programs, and you can use a space full-time, then, a commercial space or something might totally be doable for you. So you have to do a little research about your facilities. And you may want to do that before you decide on your business structure. If you feel like, well, I don't want to deal with the nonprofit thing, I want to be an LLC. Well, you got to go, you might have to go research your facilities and see what your options are. Okay. So that's another one of the biggest reasons that hybrid schools or micro schools might become a nonprofit. Okay. Now, in another episode, I will talk about actually setting up a nonprofit and dealing with boards and bylaws, like getting it started and getting it trained. It's a whole thing that I am really quite passionate about founder understanding, mostly because I didn't really understand this at all when I started it. And there was the momentum kind of went in the wrong direction for a while. Like I just acted like a business owner with a lot of the stuff that a board was supposed to be doing, just because I want to make sure it got done. I didn't want to bother them and, whatever. That wasn't really the way it was supposed to go. So I want to make sure that, other people don't make that mistake. But it's also very common in the nonprofit world. There's things you can do to help get things started off on the right foot with that. So I'll talk about that in another episode. But for now, hopefully you understand the difference between the LLC and the nonprofit. Remember, an LLC is your personal business. You can govern, you can draw from the profits, but you can't get grants. Most of the time, you can't get grants, you can't fundraise, and you have to pay the taxes. A nonprofit, you can have all of those financial benefits for the business, and you can partner with churches, rent from churches, but you cannot govern and draw a salary yourself. So I should just add on to that as a founder role for a nonprofit, usually a founder will end up kind of like becoming like the director, where the board, they kind of have to say to the board, look, can you make me the director? Because I'm running everything and hiring people and planning everything out. You can make me the director, set a salary, and you probably have to tell them how much you're working, what you're doing and all of that. They make it official that you're the director. And now you can go run the program as an employee, okay? And they should be holding you accountable. They should be doing, a review for you and all of that. And you can even attend board meetings, and you probably work closely with the president and the secretary for the agenda and all of that stuff. But you are not going to be able to vote, okay? So you could sit there in a board meeting and have the whole board vote something that you don't agree with. Okay, that can happen. And there's not anything you could do about that if you want to be a staff member who draws a salary, which is usually what a founder does because they're working a lot. If you want to just volunteer and you're able to do that, you could hire someone else to be the director, and they're the staff member, and you can sit on the board and vote. And now you do have a say in these bigger decisions. But again, you have to have at least 3 board members, and you can only be 1 vote. So your governance, which is what a board does, your say in the governance is still going to be limited as a founder. Okay. So that's I would say it's kind of like the scary part as a founder. You have this passion, you have this vision, you have to get people behind you to serve on your board. Even if you serve on the board, you only have 1 vote. And a lot of times you're the one doing the really day-to-day work to make sure it all happens, which can cause you to get burnt out and be like, well, man, I got to get paid, whatever. And that can be a tricky place to be in. And a lot of founders find themselves in that position. So, but I'm saying that because I just want you to know the realities of it, but it's also, a lot of it can be, mitigated, prevented, minimized if you understand going into it what roles you need. You can train your board, make sure you get the right people on your board, and get things set up and heading in the right direction. It can be a good model. Okay, so we'll keep talking about this in upcoming episodes. Thanks so much for listening today. Don't forget to subscribe and make sure you check out the resources I am developing at startahybridSchool.com. Send me an email anytime. I would love to hear from you. Until next time.